the 29th of September, 1957, a date that would become synonymous with one of history's most devastating nuclear accidents. Yet for over 30 years, the world knew nothing about it. The explosion was so powerful it registered as equivalent to 70 tons of TNT. A massive concrete lid weighing hundreds of tons was blown clean off like a bottle cap. Radioactive debris shot into the atmosphere, forming a deadly cloud that drifted northeast across the Ural Mountains. But this wasn't Chernobyl. This wasn't 3 Mile Island. This was something far more secretive, far more devastating in its immediate impact, and buried so deep in Soviet secrecy that the Western world only learned fragments of the truth 2 decades later. This is the story of the Kyshtym disaster, the nuclear explosion that Russia tried to erase from history. To understand what happened on that autumn evening in 1957, we need to go back to the beginning, to a place that didn't exist on any map. A city with no name, known only by a postal code, Chelyabinsk, 40. Later renamed Ozyorsk, this was one of the Soviet Union's most classified locations. Built in the early 952nd in the remote Ural Mountains, it was home to the Mayak Production Association, a sprawling nuclear complex dedicated to one purpose: producing weapons-grade plutonium for the Soviet nuclear arsenal. The city was completely closed to the outside world. Residents needed special permits to live there. Their families couldn't visit. Mail was censored. The city didn't appear on any civilian map, and even mentioning its existence could land you in a labor camp. But inside this secret world, scientists and engineers were working around the clock to match America's nuclear capabilities. The pressure was immense. Stalin wanted the bomb, and he wanted it fast. Safety protocols? Environmental concerns? These were luxuries the Soviet Union felt it couldn't afford in the race for nuclear supremacy. The Mayak facility had been operating since 1948, and from the very beginning it was a disaster waiting to happen. Between 1949 and 1952, the plant had dumped over 1 billion gallons of liquid radioactive waste directly into the Techa River. Local villages downstream were slowly being poisoned, but the residents had no idea why their crops were failing and their children were getting sick. The authorities knew. Internal documents from the time show that officials were well aware of the contamination, but the nuclear program was simply too important to slow down for safety concerns. But the river wasn't the only problem. By the mid-1952nd, Mayak had accumulated massive amounts of high-level radioactive waste, and they were running out of places to put it. Their solution was a series of underground storage tanks, massive concrete and steel containers buried beneath the facility. These tanks held some of the most radioactive material on Earth, a toxic soup of fission products, heavy metals, and enough radiation to kill a person in minutes. Tank 14 was one of the largest. Built in 1953, it contained over 1,000 cubic meters of liquid radioactive waste. The mixture was so hot, not from temperature, but from radioactive decay, that it required constant cooling to prevent the waste from boiling and potentially exploding. And that's where our story really begins. Sometime in late 1956, the cooling system for Tank 14 began to malfunction. It wasn't a sudden failure, more like a slow deterioration that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The Soviet nuclear program was under enormous pressure to meet production quotas, and shutting down a major waste storage facility for repairs would have meant delays that nobody wanted to explain to Moscow. So, they improvised. They jury-rigged temporary fixes, they monitored the temperatures and hoped for the best. But inside Tank 14, something sinister was happening. Without proper cooling, the radioactive waste began to concentrate. Water evaporated, leaving behind a thick, highly radioactive sludge. The temperature kept rising. As the waste dried out, it formed crystals of nitrate and acetate salts, compounds that, under normal circumstances, might be relatively harmless. But these weren't normal circumstances. These salts were infused with enough radioactive energy to power a small city, and they were getting more concentrated by the day. The engineers knew they were playing with fire. Internal reports from early 1957 show increasing concern about the tank's condition, but the political pressure to keep the facility running was immense. The Soviet Union was behind in the nuclear arms race, and every day of delay was seen as a victory for the Americans. By September 1957, Tank 14 had become a ticking time bomb. The waste inside had dried into a highly unstable mixture of radioactive salts. The decay heat from the radioactive material was building up with nowhere to go. The tank was essentially a giant dirty bomb waiting for the right spark. And on September 29, 1957, at exactly 4:20 in the afternoon local time, that spark came. The blast was heard for miles. Workers at the Mayak facility felt the ground shake beneath their feet. Windows shattered in buildings throughout the complex, and where Tank 14 had once been buried beneath tons of concrete and steel, there was now a gaping crater. The explosion itself wasn't nuclear, it was a chemical detonation caused by the decay heat triggering a reaction in the dried radioactive salts. But the result was arguably worse than a nuclear explosion would have been. Instead of the relatively clean blast of a nuclear weapon, this explosion sent a cocktail of the most dangerous radioactive materials on Earth shooting into the atmosphere. Strontium-90, cesium-137, cerium-144. These weren't just radioactive elements, they were biological nightmares that would contaminate everything they touched for decades. The concrete lid of the tank, weighing hundreds of tons, was blown completely off and landed hundreds of meters away. The force was equivalent to 70 tons of TNT powerful enough to register on seismographs hundreds of miles away. But the real devastation was just beginning. Within hours, a radioactive cloud began forming over the blast site. The explosion had sent radioactive particles high into the atmosphere, where they were caught by the prevailing winds and began drifting northeast across the Ural Mountains. This wasn't like Chernobyl, where the radioactive material was spread by a fire that burned for days. This was an instantaneous release of concentrated radioactive waste, and it was moving fast. The total amount of radioactive material released was staggering. By some estimates, the explosion released nearly 20 million curies of radioactivity, roughly 740 petabecquerels in modern measurements. Of that, about 2 million curies escaped beyond the immediate Mayak facility and began contaminating the surrounding countryside. To put that in perspective, while Chernobyl released more total radioactivity, much of it was in the form of noble gases that dispersed quickly. The Kyshtym disaster released concentrated, long-lived radioactive isotopes that would contaminate the land for generations. As the radioactive cloud drifted northeast, it began to settle onto the landscape below. The fallout was invisible, odorless, and utterly deadly. It contaminated everything it touched: soil, water, crops, livestock, and people. The area that would eventually be known as the East Ural Radioactive Trace stretched for over 300 kilometers northeast of the blast site. At its widest point, the contaminated zone was nearly 50 kilometers across, covering a total area of about 23, 0 square kilometers, an area larger than the state of Massachusetts. Within this contaminated zone lived 217 settlements with a combined population of about 270 people. Most of them had no idea what had just happened to them. The Soviet authorities' response was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Within hours of the explosion, emergency teams were dispatched from Moscow, but their first priority wasn't helping the contaminated populations, it was controlling information. Roads leading to the blast site were blocked, telephone lines were cut, military personnel established checkpoints around the affected area. Anyone trying to leave was detained and questioned. Anyone trying to enter was turned away. But the contamination was already spreading faster than the authorities could contain it. In the villages closest to the blast site, radiation levels were off the charts. In some areas, exposure rates reached 400 microentgens per second levels that would deliver a dangerous dose of radiation in just a few hours. The first signs of the disaster weren't official announcements or evacuation orders. They were dead animals. Farmers in the contaminated zone began finding their livestock dead in the fields. Horses, cattle, sheep, all apparently healthy one day, dead the next. The animals' hair began falling out in clumps before they died. Their skin developed strange sores. Crops withered and died in the fields. Vegetables that had been ready for harvest turned black and rotted on the vine. Wells that had provided clean water for generations suddenly became undrinkable. And then people began getting sick. The initial symptoms were subtle enough that many people didn't connect them to any particular cause. Fatigue, nausea, headaches, the kind of general malaise that could be attributed to any number of factors. But as days turned into weeks, the symptoms got worse. Hair loss, skin lesions, the persistent vomiting. Blood tests showed plummeting white blood cell counts. Children were particularly affected. their developing bodies far more vulnerable to radiation damage than adults. In the most contaminated settlements, the radioactive fallout had settled into the soil at concentrations of up to 150 megabecquerels per square meter. To put that in perspective, areas with even a fraction of that contamination would be considered uninhabitable today. The contaminated food was perhaps the worst part. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, contamination levels in local food supplies reached astronomical levels up to 10 kilobecquerels per kilogram in some samples. That's thousands of times higher than what would be considered safe today. Milk was particularly dangerous. Cows grazing in contaminated fields were producing milk with strontium-90 levels that were literally off the scale. Since strontium-90 mimics calcium in the body, it was being incorporated directly into people's bones and teeth, where it would continue irradiating them from the inside for the rest of their lives. Local doctors began seeing patients with symptoms they'd never encountered before: skin that wouldn't heal, blood disorders that didn't respond to treatment, children born with developmental problems that seemed to have no clear cause. But when doctors tried to report these unusual patterns to regional health authorities, they were told to keep quiet. The official line was that there was nothing unusual happening in the area. Any doctor who persisted in reporting strange illnesses faced transfer to remote posts or worse. It took the authorities nearly a week to even begin evacuations, and when they finally did, the process was chaotic and incomplete. On October 6, 1957, a full week after the explosion, the first evacuations finally began. But even then, the authorities didn't tell people what had really happened. Residents of the most contaminated villages were told they were being temporarily relocated for agricultural improvements. They were given just a few hours to pack what they could carry and were loaded onto trucks and trains. Many families were split up in the chaos. Children at school in one village, while their parents were evacuated from another. Elderly residents who couldn't travel quickly left behind. Pets and livestock abandoned to die in the contaminated zone. Over the following months, 22 entire villages were permanently abandoned. About 200 people were forcibly relocated, their homes and communities erased as if they had never existed. But the vast majority of people in the contaminated zone weren't evacuated at all. The authorities made a cold calculation. It was easier to manage the fallout from radiation exposure than to relocate hundreds of thousands of people. Instead, they established what they called protection criteria. Areas with strontium-90 contamination above 74 kilobecquerels per square meter were considered too dangerous for normal economic activity. This created a high-priority remediation zone of about 10 square kilometers around the blast site. The most contaminated area, about 166 square kilometers directly downwind from the explosion, was designated as a permanent exclusion zone. In 1966, this became the East Ural State Reserve, supposedly a nature preserve but actually a radioactive wasteland that remains off-limits to this day. The government's response to the health crisis was equally callous. They established special medical programs to monitor the affected population, but the focus was on studying the effects of radiation exposure rather than treating the victims. 66 residents were eventually diagnosed with chronic radiation syndrome, a devastating condition caused by prolonged exposure to high levels of radiation. But the real number of people affected was certainly much higher. Many cases were never officially recognized, either because people didn't have access to proper medical care or because doctors were pressured not to make the diagnosis. Meanwhile, the Soviet propaganda machine went into overdrive to hide what had happened. The explosion occurred in a closed city that didn't officially exist, in a region that was already restricted to outsiders. It was the perfect cover-up. For the next 3 decades, the Kyshtym disaster remained one of the world's best-kept secrets. The Soviet government not only denied that any accident had occurred, they denied that the Mayak facility even existed. When Western intelligence agencies began picking up hints that something had happened in the Urals, Soviet officials dismissed the reports as Western propaganda. They claimed that any unusual radioactivity detected in the region came from atmospheric nuclear tests or natural sources. The first cracks in the cover-up appeared in April 1958, when Western press outlets began reporting rumors of a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union. But without concrete evidence, these reports were easily dismissed as Cold War speculation. The breakthrough came in 1976, when Soviet scientist Zhores Medvedev, who had defected to the West, published an article in the journal New Scientist detailing what he knew about the disaster. Medvedev had pieced together the story from scientific papers that mentioned contamination in the Urals, conversations with colleagues, and his own observations of unusual research projects. But even Medvedev's account was incomplete and was widely dismissed by Western governments. The CIA had actually produced detailed analyses of the disaster as early as 1958, but these remained classified for decades. It wasn't until 1989, 32 years after the explosion, that the Soviet government finally officially acknowledged that the Kyshtym disaster had occurred. Even then, they downplayed its severity and continued to withhold crucial details about the contamination and health effects. The name Kyshtym itself tells the story of the cover-up. The explosion actually occurred near the secret city of Ozyorsk, but since Ozyorsk didn't appear on any maps, Western observers named the disaster after Kyshtym, the nearest town that could actually be found on a map. While the Soviet government was busy denying that anything had happened, scientists were quietly studying one of the largest radioactive contamination events in human history. The East Ural Radioactive Trace became an unintentional laboratory for understanding how radiation affects ecosystems over long periods. The contamination was dominated by strontium-90, a radioactive isotope with a half-life of about 29 years. Unlike some radioactive materials that decay quickly, strontium-90 would remain dangerous for centuries. And because it behaves chemically like calcium, it was easily absorbed by plants and animals, working its way up the food chain. In the most contaminated areas, entire ecosystems collapsed. Forests died and regrew as stunted, malformed versions of their former selves. Animal populations crashed and only slowly recovered. Many species showed increased rates of mutation and genetic damage that persisted for generations. But nature also proved surprisingly resilient in some ways. In areas where humans were excluded, wildlife populations eventually rebounded, even if the animals carried high levels of radioactive contamination. The exclusion zone became an accidental wildlife preserve, much like the area around Chernobyl would decades later. The contamination wasn't evenly distributed. Because of the way the radioactive cloud had drifted and settled, some areas were devastated while neighboring regions remained relatively unaffected. This patchy contamination made it easier for authorities to claim that any problems were isolated incidents rather than part of a larger disaster. Agricultural areas within the contaminated zone faced special challenges. Crops grown in contaminated soil absorbed radioactive isotopes, making them dangerous to eat. The Soviet authorities developed techniques like deep ploughing and topsoil removal to reduce contamination levels, but these were expensive and only partially effective. By the 1980s, about half of the most contaminated agricultural land had been returned to economic use, but only after decades of remediation efforts. Even today, some areas remain too contaminated for normal agriculture. Despite the official secrecy surrounding the disaster, Soviet scientists began an extensive research program to study its effects. This research would eventually provide crucial data about radiation exposure and its health consequences, though much of it remained classified for decades. The affected population became the subject of intensive medical monitoring. Every resident of the contaminated zone was registered and tracked. Their health was monitored through regular examinations and blood tests. Their exposure levels were calculated and recorded. This created one of the largest and most detailed studies of radiation exposure ever conducted. Researchers followed tens of thousands of people for decades, documenting the long-term health effects of living in a contaminated environment. The results were sobering. Studies found increased rates of leukemia and other cancers among the exposed population. The risk was particularly high for children who had been exposed to contaminated milk in the first few years after the accident. One of the most significant findings was about strontium-90 exposure. Unlike external radiation exposure, which affects the whole body relatively evenly, strontium-90 concentrates in bones and teeth, creating hotspots of intense radiation exposure. This internal contamination proved to be particularly dangerous for developing children. The research also revealed the inadequacy of the evacuation criteria used at the time. People who were allowed to remain in lightly contaminated areas still received significant radiation doses over the following years. Many developed health problems that were never officially connected to the disaster. But perhaps the most important scientific legacy of Kyshtym was the development of new approaches to managing radioactive contamination. The techniques developed for remediation in the Urals would later be applied to other contaminated sites around the world, including Chernobyl. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the full scope of the Kyshtym disaster began to be understood internationally. With the opening of Soviet archives and the ability of Russian scientists to speak freely, a clearer picture of the event finally emerged. The International Atomic Energy Agency classified Kyshtym as a Level 6 accident on the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale, the same level as the Chernobyl disaster, though Chernobyl was later reclassified as Level 7. This made Kyshtym one of the most serious nuclear accidents in history. International scientific organizations began studying the disaster and its long-term effects. The contaminated zone became a research site for understanding radiation ecology and the long-term effects of environmental contamination. The disaster also influenced international nuclear safety standards. The lessons learned from Kyshtym contributed to improved designs for nuclear waste storage facilities and better emergency response procedures. But for the victims of the disaster, international recognition came too late. Many of the most heavily exposed individuals had already died, their health problems never officially acknowledged as being related to radiation exposure. Today, more than 65 years after the explosion, the legacy of Kyshtym continues to shape the region. The East Ural State Reserve remains a restricted area, though radiation levels have decreased significantly over the decades. The city of Ozyorsk still exists, though it's no longer a closed city. The Mayak facility continues to operate, now focusing on nuclear waste reprocessing and plutonium disposition rather than weapons production. Modern safety standards are far higher than they were in the 1950s, but the facility remains one of the most contaminated places on Earth. For the scientific community, Kyshtym represents both a tragedy and a valuable source of data. The long-term studies of the exposed population continue to provide crucial information about radiation health effects. This research has influenced radiation protection standards worldwide and continues to inform our understanding of the risks associated with nuclear technology. The disaster also serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of excessive secrecy in nuclear programs. The Soviet Union's obsession with hiding the accident prevented proper medical treatment for victims and delayed the implementation of safety improvements that might have prevented similar accidents. In recent years, Russian authorities have been more open about discussing the disaster, though many details remain classified. Memorial sites have been established for the evacuated villages, and efforts are underway to preserve the historical record of what happened. The Kyshtym disaster offers sobering lessons about nuclear safety, government accountability, and the long-term consequences of prioritizing secrecy over public health. First and most obviously, it demonstrates the catastrophic consequences that can result from inadequate safety measures in nuclear facilities. The cooling system failure that triggered the disaster was entirely preventable, but political pressure to maintain production schedules prevented proper maintenance. Second, it shows how official secrecy can multiply the harm caused by nuclear accidents. The Soviet government's refusal to acknowledge the disaster prevented proper medical treatment for victims and delayed cleanup efforts that might have reduced long-term contamination. Third, it highlights the global nature of nuclear risks. While the Kyshtym disaster was hidden from the world for decades, radioactive contamination doesn't respect national borders. The techniques developed to study and remediate the contamination have been applied to nuclear accidents around the world. Finally, it demonstrates the importance of long-term monitoring and research after nuclear accidents. The decades-long study of the Kyshtym-affected population has provided crucial data that has informed radiation protection standards worldwide. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Kyshtym disaster was not the explosion itself, but the decades of denial that followed. While the immediate physical damage was contained to a relatively small area, the human cost was magnified by the government's refusal to acknowledge what had happened. Victims of the disaster spent decades without proper medical care, their illnesses dismissed or ignored by authorities who insisted nothing unusual had occurred. Families were torn apart by forced evacuations that were never properly explained. Entire communities vanished from the map, their existence erased from official records. The psychological trauma was perhaps as damaging as the physical effects. Imagine living with mysterious illnesses that no doctor would acknowledge, in a place that officially didn't exist, affected by an accident that never happened according to your government. Even today, many victims of the disaster have never received proper compensation or recognition. The Soviet government's policy of denial meant that many health effects were never officially documented, making it difficult for survivors to prove their connection to the disaster. The Kyshtym disaster stands as one of the most significant nuclear accidents in history, not just for its immediate impact, but for what it reveals about the intersection of nuclear technology, political power, and human costs. For over 30 years, the Soviet Union successfully hid one of the world's worst nuclear disasters from international scrutiny. They erased villages from maps, silenced witnesses, and denied that anything had happened. It was a cover-up of staggering scope and efficiency. But truth, like radioactive contamination, has a way of spreading beyond the boundaries that authorities try to impose. Scientific papers with unexplained references to Ural contamination, defectors with fragmentary knowledge, intelligence reports that couldn't be fully suppressed. Slowly, inevitably, the story emerged. Today, we know that the explosion at Mayak released about 74 petabecquerels of radioactive material into the environment, roughly 4% of the non-noble gas releases from Chernobyl, but concentrated in a much smaller area. We know that 270 people lived in the contaminated zone, and that thousands suffered health effects that were never officially acknowledged. We know that 22 villages disappeared from the map, their residents scattered and their histories erased. We know that an area of 23 square kilometers was contaminated with long-lived radioactive isotopes that will remain dangerous for centuries. But perhaps most importantly, we know that nuclear accidents cannot be hidden forever, no matter how powerful the government trying to conceal them. The truth emerges, sometimes decades later, but it emerges. The Kyshtym disaster serves as a stark reminder that nuclear technology demands not just technical expertise, but transparency, accountability, and respect for human life. The Soviet Union's nuclear program achieved its immediate goal. They got their bomb, and they got it quickly. But the human and environmental costs of that achievement continue to this day. In an age when several nations are rapidly expanding their nuclear capabilities, often under conditions of intense secrecy, the lessons of Kyshtym remain painfully relevant. Nuclear accidents will happen, that much is certain. The question is whether we'll learn from the mistakes of the past, or whether we'll continue to prioritize political considerations over human safety. The explosion that rocked the Ural Mountains on September 29, 1957, lasted only seconds. But its consequences, scientific, environmental, political, and human, continue to reverberate more than 6 decades later. The Soviet Union tried to erase this disaster from history. They failed. The radioactive trace across the Urals stands as a permanent reminder that some secrets are too big to bury, and some truths too important to hide. This was the Kyshtym disaster, the nuclear explosion that Russia tried to erase. It couldn't be erased then, and it shouldn't be forgotten now.